anyone over 30. You may recall that one that really got their fathers and mothers and older generation up in arms over this. Now, of course, those over 30 now say, don't trust anybody under 30. Groovy, cool. What if they made a war and nobody came? Love it. Hell no, we won't go. Tell it like it is. A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. And the one that I really love, how sweet it is. Their experimentations in grass, marijuana, hash, LSD, and others is extremely important because they, like the Bohemians, wanted to plunge deep into their consciousness to develop a connection between the outer and the inner. It's to this end that they set up deprivation tanks to shut out reality and to see where they can plunge themselves. They were into the whole question of soul. The very thing that the Beats were looking for, they carried even further. To get to the essence of what they believed in, I'm going to read to you from P.J. O'Rourke, who was there at the time. He became, I don't know where he is now, one of the leading humor writers of America. And his article was entitled, Harry, Krishna, and Me. What I believed in the 60s, he begins. Everything, he answers. You name it, and I believed it. I believed love was all you need. I believe you should be here now. I believe drugs can make you a better person. I believe I could hitch to California with 35 cents and people would be glad to feed me. I believe private property was wrong. I believe my girlfriend was a witch, a good witch. I believe my parents were Nazi space monsters. I believe the university was putting saltpeter in the cafeteria food. You all know what saltpeter is? I can see some of you just looking, but anyone not know where it is, what it is? It's meant to curb your testosterone so that sexual urges are not be prominent in your life. And this was all rumored when I was in the army that we were all given saltpeter 3 times a day until we got into battle. I believe stones had souls. I believe Yoko Ono was an artist. I believe Bob Dylan was a musician and a poet. And interestingly enough, 40 years later, he's given the Nobel Prize for just that. I believed I would live forever or until 21. Whichever came first. I believed the world was about to an end. I believed the age of Aquarius was about to begin and happen. I believe the I Ching set to cut classes and take over the dean's office. I believe wearing my hair long would end poverty and injustice. I believe there was a great throbbing web of psychic rooters and we were all part of it. I managed to believe that Gandhi and H. Rap Brown at the same time. with the exception of anything my parents said, I believed everything. There was this enormous gap between the generations, between the sons and daughters of the counterculture and their parents. And this led to a huge...
Excuse me, what is the date of that? What year was that written?
The question was, or is, what is the date this was written? And the answer is, I think it's the New Republic. It's November 2nd, 1987.
Thank you.
When Rourke was then getting along.
That's quite a memoir.
So what is it that the Beats and the counterculture wanted? What was their goal apart from that which I've already identified to you? In order to understand this, you have to understand the huge dissection between the generations, between the previous America and the America that they wanted to achieve, because they had very definite goals in mind, and even more important, they wanted to alter the values of American society. The word counterculture was affixed to them because that sums up exactly what they wanted to accomplish. It was a counterculture they were espousing. Now the person who summed this up was an interesting man. He was in his 40s when it came along. He was swept up into it. He was a social psychologist.
Timothy Leary.
The book is called The Pursuit of Loneliness. And it's a magnificent, small book. And what he did was to sum up the difference between the old culture and the new culture. The old culture being people over 30, and the new culture being under 30. There are almost an infinite number of polarities, he writes, by which one can differentiate between the two cultures. The old culture, when forced to choose, tends to give preference to property rights over personal rights, technological requirements over human needs, competition over cooperation, violence over sexuality, concentration over distribution, the producer over the consumer, means over ends, secrecy over openness, social forms over personal expression, striving over gratification.
So who wrote that? Who wrote that book? This alone.
I'll give it to you afterwards.
Huh?
But his name was Philip Slater.
Oh.
The new culture, to contrast what was happening in the 60s, is based on the assumption that important human needs are easily identified and that the resources for doing so are plentiful. Competition is unnecessary. And the only danger to humans is human aggression. There is no reason outside of human perversity for peace not to reign and for life not to be spent in the cultivation of joy and beauty. So, the contrast that he's presenting to you is basically the difference between scarcity and abundance. And the counterculture really stressed all of this. This was the most, and still is at that time, the richest country in the world. This society has solved every problem that connects up to human needs. There was no reason, they argued, that anybody need go ill-clad, ill-fed, ill-housed. There was the means in the United States to take care of everybody there was abundance in the United States. The only question was the distribution of that abundance. And that indeed was under the hands of the old culture. So they wanted to reverse all of this. And they set about to doing it. They did it through a whole variety of ways. You may recall that the Bohemians set up the small magazines to espouse what they believed and then educate other people. They were the underground newspapers that sprang up all over the United States to do just that. They set up communes. There were literally hundreds of communes in the United States that experimented with communal living. From middle-class human living to working-class human living, and so on. And they used what's now called drugs. Well, there were drugs, particularly marijuana. Marijuana came into existence basically with jazz musicians in the 1920s and 30s. And by the 30s, it was being outlawed. But with the counterculture, they began to use that particular technique for plunging deeply in and also to relating to one another. You can contrast this with alcoholic drinking. Go into any bar and people indeed drink solitarily. They don't share their drink with the person next to them. Everyone drinks separately. But with marijuana, once you start smoking it, you then pass the joint around to everybody else, bringing everybody into this particular experience. It may have been individualistic in the sense that they wanted to achieve creativity again, but they truly believed in a communal togetherness, and that people should come together in harmony, and indeed in love, and indeed cooperation. They were fiercely opposed to competition, which created a hierarchical society and led to the difference in the classes between those who were extremely wealthy to those who were extremely poor. And they began to experiment sexually. They had picked up what the Bohemians did and the beats and so on, but they carried it much further. For the first time in American history, perhaps even human history, men and women began living together without the sanctity of marriage. That truly horrified parents. That free love was going on. That there was all kind of sexuality beyond means and beyond control that their sons and daughters were engaging in. So a lot of couples in those days who moved in together secretly and only had one telephone, and before the telephone rang, they quickly ascertained who was ringing it before they answered it. Because the parents found out indeed they would descend, often did, to break up their relationship. That idea of experimenting in relationships goes down to the present day. That's one of the great impacts of the counterculture. And they also engaged in communal activities that music brought them into, that dance brought them into. They were the first generation to create an entire different kind of music. Hitherto before that, it was the older generation that presented the music down to the other generations. Everything was reversed. People like Bob Dylan, who was barely in his late teens, came along, who set the standard for the new music, and that spread across the United States. And the Beatles were perhaps the best example of that, the group that came over from England. But there were countless dozens of others. And the music was tended to create the same kind of message that the underground newspapers do, all that their slogans did. Now, these were all people that would be called liberal or leftists. But for the most part, the cultural radicals, small r, were not involved in organizing or marches or demonstrations. That was the political wing of the counterculture. They were the ones who led the strikes that took place in American cities against racism. They were the ones who demonstrated against lower income. degradation in America, but the culture radicals basically were trying to transform America culturally. And that's what they tried to do in so many different ways. Furthermore, they went one step further, and that has almost bring us down to the present. Because they reached out in terms of equity and equality and justice and love, they supported minority groups in their various quests to achieve some kind of empowerment in the United States. So by the late 1960s into the 70s, a whole movement called cultural identity came pouring into the United States. Blacks through Black Power, women through now, Chicano groups, gender groups, sexual groups began to empower themselves and demand an equitable say in American society and not be, indeed, beholden to the kind of victimization that they were always being subject to. So by the end of the 1960s into the 70s, you had the most powerful movement in American society that indeed were alienated by American values, but then supported an entirely new system of the United States. That was indeed the situation in the country until the counterattack began by the older generations who were in power, particularly people like Richard Nixon and others, to the suggestion that abundance can solve everything and that we should reestablish new lines of distribution. Suddenly, in 1973, came the gasoline crisis. Suddenly, there was not enough gasoline to go around in the United States. Suddenly, a recession occurred, and there were not enough jobs to go around. This was not a coincidence. This was actually devised by the gas companies, as you know. There was plenty of gasoline in the ground. But capitalism doesn't rest on abundance, it rests on scarcity.
No,
and jobs. There was plenty of jobs to go around, but there was a cutback by corporations. And so by the mid-1970s, the movement was basically over. And it began to peter out, except for the great cultural changes that occurred in terms of music and relationships and dance and so on. These went on down to the present. Which brings us, therefore, to the present. Because alienation is very much a part of our culture at this particular time. And I'm going to return, therefore, to one of the public intellectuals in America, David Brooks, that I started reading to you early on. I don't have the problem of wind in a classroom, but I prefer this to the classroom. America has always been a divided company, he wrote. But for the most of our history, it was held together by a unifying national story. It was an exodus story. It was a story of leaving the oppressions of the old world, venturing into a wilderness and creating a new promised land. In the story, America was a fulfillment of human history, the last great hope on earth. It was an explicitly Judeo-Christian story built on a certain view of God's providential plan. Without civic mythology, no longer unifies American confidence. So that's how he begins his article, and I'm going to get back to the rest of it later. So what happened to end this particular mythological origins of the United States that unified the country? Well, by the 1980s, the counterculture of the 1960s was under severe attack by the conservatives and the American right. They put the blame on what was happening to the country at that particular time on identity politics, and particularly the 1960s and 70s, the hippies and yippies. A man by the name of Robert Bork, B-O-R-K, who was nominated to the Supreme Court and then rejected, wrote a very powerful book which gave it away. The United States now faces, he wrote, I'm having a cramp in my leg, I've got to stand. The United States now faces the question of how far a culture can stretch to accommodate more and more ethnic groups and religious and still remain recognizable as a culture rather as an agglomeration of cultures. Which leads to the further question, can a national identity, something resembling a national community, be maintained when cultural unity is destroyed? We are, after all, no longer one united people. You just saved my life. Descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, and very similar in our manner and customs. But we are no longer, he wrote, a people joined by common political experiences and memories, and with every year that passes, we are less like that. So far as I know, he concluded, no multi-ethnic society has ever been peaceful except when constrained by external force. Ethnicity appears to be so powerful that it can overcome rationality. Had we been at the founding of people as diverse and culturally disunited as we now are today, there would have been no founding. A Constitution and a Bill of Rights would not have been proposed, and if proposed, would have been provoked political warfare that would have torn the country too deeply for any hope of unity. And he goes on in this excoriating vein. The 1960s was the basic cause for leading to the disunity that now exists today, the terrible alienation that exists between groups, and other people have picked up on this in the contemporary period, although some have expanded it a little bit. Bret Stephens, who writes for the New York Times, wrote an article in which he writes about the Trump presidency and no guardrails. In 1993, the Wall Street Journal published a famous editorial called No Guardrails, which tried to locate the source of the moral chaos that has engulfed much of America. How, in T.S. Eliot's phrase, did so many become undone? The editors wanted to know. Their answer, in a nutshell, was 1968, when both the political and cultural elements of the counterculture came together. Specifically, the culture of excess, excuses, and permission that abruptly supplanted the older America's ethic of modesty, responsibility, and restraint. The editorial noted, certain rules that for a long time had governed behavior also became devalued. Whatever else was going on here we were repeatedly lowering the barriers of acceptable political and personal conduct. And then Stephen goes on to say, I have always admired that editorial, but now it needs updating. How did so many of the same people who spent the past 50 years bemoaning the decline of morality and decorum become the agents and enablers of the most morally grotesque administration in American history? That's Stevens. But it was, and it is, David Brooks, who was one of the smartest columnists in America, who really summed it up beautifully, and I shall conclude with his words, because it really pinpoints the zeitgeist of the United States at the present time and into the future, apparently, to how long I do not know. The historian always looks to the past, never into the future. Brooks, remember I had quoted to you from the very beginning. What he now says, that there are 4 rival narratives in America today, each competing for the essence of America. And he's absolutely right. First is that I need my glasses. First, there is the libertarian narrative that dominates the GOP. America is a land of free individuals responsible for their own fate. This story celebrates the dynamism of the free market. Its prime value is freedom. Second, there is a narrative of globalized America. This is the narrative dominant in Silicon Valley and beyond. Third, there is a story of multicultural America. It sees Americans as members of groups whose status is largely determined by the sins of the past and present. Finally, writes Brooks, there is a narrative of America first, the narrative Donald Trump told last year, which resonated with many voters. America first is a conviction that the country has lost its traditional identity because of contamination and weakness, the contamination of others, foreigners, immigrants, Muslims, the weakness of elites who have no allegiance to the country because they've been globalized. And finally, says Brooks, personally, I don't think any of these narratives is a viable basis for successful governance in the 20th century. That's about as prophetic a mark as there is. There is no unifying myth anymore, and I mean myth in the positive sense. There is no one narrative which exists. We are indeed divided, not just polarized in terms of blue and red. That is actually simplifying everything. There is no longer a myth to connect it all. Now, one of the problems, which is not a problem, one of the beautiful problems, one of the beautiful issues, if you ask yourself, what words specifically have guided this particular country and do so today? What's the guiding principles of America, or the guiding values of America?
Diversity.
Diversity is a good one, yes.
Democracy.
Democracy is a very good one. Let's
Legit-
start first, though, with promise. This was the first country to come along with a promise, not of the past, but of the future. This was the first future-oriented society to appear in Western civilization, indeed in any civilization. The promise of the future always guided us and moved us. It was a promise based on the fact that all people were created equal. So equality and promise go together. And what's the third thing in this trinity? It was indeed expectations. The expectation that justice would be the guiding link to cover everything and everybody in America. Those three things are now being contested in terms of definitions by these various groups. But you have to expect this to be the case in a society that is so unusual as this is. I am not a great believer in a certain aspect of America being, the leading country in the world. American exceptional is a phrase that's given. But in a very real way, this is an exceptional society. Not the society that Donald Trump talks about being great again. This is a great society, as a matter of fact. Not completely so. We have huge issues which divide us. There's no reason for the class structure to be the way it is between billionaires and the lower class people. There's no reason for that whatsoever. But as long as this exists, there's going to be turmoil because of the expectations of justice and equality and promise and the future. This has always been a country where these issues have always led to great tension and to those alienated movements which I spoke about. Always. It will continue to do so. Because it is a fabulous culture that has offered, indeed, a new vision of human beings. Most other societies look back to the past. You may recall I started off my lectures by talking about how very few Americans know American history. People were very upset by some of the things I offered. I was even criticized for some of them. But my point was, not to know the past or be concerned about the past means you can create a whole new future. One of the unique aspects of America is a sense of innovation. That's extraordinary. We were the first society to be posed in this particular way because of the expectations of the future. Compare. I'm a historian. What is my salary of a historian? Let's say all historians earn approximately $90,000 a year as professors. Let's take some people like George Lucas or Steven Spielberg. George Lucas and Steven, who you all know, correct? Are billionaires. Why are they billionaires? And why are historians not? Because they deal with science fiction that connects up to the future. The future. They've created stories not of the present, although they may use certain values of the present, to project into the future. Science fiction is one of our leading genres in America, not the past. Historians deal with the past, and nobody wants to hear about the past. They don't want to hear about my past anyway, for the most part. And I think it's very interesting. But Americans are not historians. They don't learn from the past because they don't want to, because their expectations are oriented differently. And this is extraordinary in American society. I spent a month in Japan lecturing once. And I was blown away by the difference between America and Japan. Wherever I went to Japan, it was tradition, with a capital T, that mattered. Tradition. When I boarded the bus to go somewhere, I was informed by people, whatever you do, when you reach your stop, do not get up and go to the exit. I said, why not? They said, you'll find out. Sure enough, I was concentrating on my exit, so I get up, and I moved to the front of the bus to get out, as you would in New York City, quickly, especially if you're in New York, make a beeline for it. I moved quickly. Suddenly, I felt in my ribs some sharp object, and it was an elbow. It was an elbow of a woman in her 80s, because when you descend from a bus in Japan, you allow people who are the ages to get off first. That is tradition, and you wait in line for it. When I lectured in Japan, I was informed, do not expect questions about your lecture. Did not expect questions about my lecture? I said, why not? You'll find out. And there were no questions about my lecture when I lectured. Oh, but other things. So I asked my friend, why? He said, because to question authority is to demean and undermine him. And you are indeed one of the most important figures because you are a professor. So they don't want to embarrass you. They don't want to embarrass themselves. And then came the ultimate question when I was there. This was a university student who then said to me, I don't understand America. It seems to be so diverse, so different. It's a large country. There's anything unifying it. What is the unification of America? What keeps together, he asked me, which was a very smart question. I'd never been asked that question before, so I thought quickly, and I said, money. Money is indeed the focal point for all Americans. They must work to earn money. And he looked at me and says, I thought so. I was flying back, and then I thought back to that question, and I said to myself, as I frequently do, Boskin, you're an idiot. It's not money. He was asking for a question that dealt with spirituality or religion, small r, even a capital R. What is the spirit of America that keeps it together and not tear itself apart? That's what he was asking. And money divides us. Money doesn't unify us. It may be a great goal that everybody wants to achieve, but it's not a unifier. I grew up with a bunch of guys my age. We were all bar mitzvah at just about the same time. We lived together, that is, as a teenage until we all went to college. Later on, they all went differently. They became professionals. A lot of my friends became doctors, dentists, lawyers, TV producers, and so on. I was the only one to become a professor. Well, those who had achieved a great deal of success and a great deal of money went to clubs and on vacations, different from those who were below them. And pretty soon, they split up because of economic factors. They began to lead different class lives. And the only person who was invited across that divide was me, because nobody was threatened by a professor, since I earned very little money compared to them. And it was true. I was at the bottom rung of the professional classes. And anybody who became an elementary school teacher was even below me. And that's one of the most offensive things in the United States. To pay a librarian or a teacher in America among the lowest salaries, I mean, these are the most important thing, conveying values, education, developing the mind is a total insult. And the counterculture tried to reverse this. They put their emphasis on the creative self, as did the Bohemians, as did the Beats do. The counterculture did the same thing. And the purpose was to recreate a kind of soul within a culture that had so much great promise, so much of the future going for itself. And that is one of the great beauties of the alienation in American society. You have been beautiful to have come. This is my final concluding talk. I look forward to seeing you sometime in Cambridge or Boston. When you come, give me a call, we'll get together. Be well. Go well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Drew.
Okay, so you think David Brooks is the best?